What's up, guys? Welcome to the inaugural episode of ISOBALL. I'm your host, Colin Martin, going to be your host every week. We're looking to get these up. And for anybody that's new to the channel, maybe you've been checking out Banning's live streams, you're not fully in depth in the Next Man Up lore. Banning and I started this channel together. We both have made podcasts together. We used to do one weekly, the two of us. We both made some of that short form content. I haven't been as active since the NBA draft season. And then Banning, of course, has been super active streaming, still putting up those short-term videos as well. And also, the MMA channel, it's new, but I'm expecting big things from it. I know he is as well. But it's a pleasure to have you guys. The first episode of ISOBALL. So this podcast, we're looking to have guests on in the future, but it's just, I'm running the ISO. It's just going to be me. We're going to be talking about NBA. As the college season progresses, we'll bring that up, but definitely want to stay NBA focused. And also, it's just probably going to be one of the more casual things we do on this channel. I'm going to sit down, talk ball. I want to engage with you guys a lot. And, even if the views or the likes start slow at first, I think we're fully in depth of just coming on here weekly to talk ball. So with that being said, let's get straight into it. I'll record these on Saturdays or Sundays, and as you guys know, the NBA season's starting right now. If this goes up on Monday, it's tomorrow. If you're seeing it on Tuesday, it's tonight. Knicks Celtics, the first game of the season, and there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of bases we have to cover. Starting the podcast up right as the season starts is going to be tough, but I guess that just means this first episode is jam-packed. I'm going to give you all my takes now. Now, I don't want to sit here and say, I think so-and-so is going to win the finals. I don't want to be one of those podcasts that sits here and says, I think the Cleveland Cavaliers are going to win 55 games. You don't care about that. We don't need to get so specific. But one thing I know you guys do care about, one thing that's great for resume, stat padding, and great to shout out your favorite players in is the awards. So I want to talk NBA awards, and without further ado, let's just start at the top. For me, I think everybody cares the most about the MVP. When people talk about Hall of Fame careers, people talk about these young guys that have these, great things on their stat sheets. It's their accolades that comes first, and it's the MVP. That's the top dog of them all. There's a lot of candidates this year. I think now that Jokic has won 2, Embiid won his, I think it's about as open as it's ever going to be. There's so many young guys that are kind of starting that next wave. I don't think anyone's going to sit on a podcast like this and tell you that they think LeBron or Curry's going to be the MVP this year. It's kind of that new wave, and I think the betting odds are kind of interesting. If you're talking about a player that could win their first MVP of their career this year, there's a lot of guys that have that possible trajectory, but I'm going to start at 3. I'll give you 3 options for each of these awards. I'll start with my third choice, work my way up to my final pick. Third choice got to be Luka Doncic. I think the Mavericks are just going to be just as competitive as they've ever been. Obviously, last year, coming in not as one of those top 3 seeds, making that finals run. That's exactly what they look to build on this year. And a pretty proficient offseason. I'm a big fan of Derrick Jones Jr. Obviously, he's on the way out, part of the Clippers now. But you bring in Clay. You have a very similar front court. Of course, you keep that backcourt of Kyrie and Luka that at one point was one of the most efficient duos of all time. There's going to be good things. And we know Luka, as he progresses, as he gets older, he's only got better and better. Even this dude is 20 years old, making all NBA first teams. You know what you get from Luka Doncic. He's the hub of an offense when we get into award seasons and you're looking at counting stats and things of that nature. It's going to be really hard not to have Luka as one of those guys towards the top. One of those near triple-double sort of guys, and honestly, just a guy that I expect to continue to progress to the superstar level. So if he's going to be in this MVP race, it's going to be based on the Mavericks' success. I think if, with this new expectation that, this is a team that just made the finals, obviously a little bit outmatched by the Celtics. If the Mavericks finish as a 6th seed or a 5th seed, which is pretty reasonable in a super loaded Western Conference, I don't think that's going to be enough. I think if the Mavericks can finish as the second best, the best team in the West, then there's going to be a lot of people cheering on Luka for that award, and I think that would be fair. But I got him at 3. At 2, it's the only returner I have here. I'll give you a spoiler. I think Jokic is going to be right up there. Losing KCP is going to be a huge hit. I think There's definitely a narrative around Contavious that he's this guy that really just shoots and plays defense, which he's a proficient shooter. He's a great perimeter defender, but he's the ultimate glue in that backcourt. And Jamal Murray, who is such a proficient scorer, is so good at getting to his spots. You kind of cover that up when you have a guy like KCP with him in the backcourt. So I do think that's really going to be tough for the Nuggets team success, but I think that only opens things up for Jokic more and more often. Some of these times where, this Nuggets offense with Michael Malone is so efficient, where it's Jokic in the post and he has the option to either kick it out with that incredible passing ability he does or put it right up. I think a lot of the time he has the option to do both, but when he had a guy like KCP sitting in the corner, I think he was more willing to pass. I think this might be Jokic's highest scoring season yet. I think he's going to feel more of a pressure on him to put the ball in the hoop. Obviously, he's been a great scorer, one of the better big man scorers of all time, but when you're such a plus playmaker and you have those weapons on the outside, I think you feel a little more optimal passing it out sometimes. I don't think he's going to feel that way as often. I think it's probably going to be one of Jokic's best scoring seasons ever. I think Michael Malone knows that this Nuggets timeline is shortening and shortening. They're bringing a guy like Russell Westbrook off the bench. They know that this team doesn't really have as much time left as you would have thought so, maybe just a year or 2 years ago, because with KCP out, with this whole second and third apron thing, you don't really know what MPJ's future is like with the team. I say this all to say, I think Jokic is just going to have a dominant offensive season like he has before. I think the playmaking is going to be there. He's kind of a shoo-in to average a triple-double or around triple-double numbers. And if the Nuggets, even if they lose Caldwell Pope, who I think the NBA media understands is so versatile, is so important, if they go out there and they're one of the most competitive teams in the West, Jokic is putting up numbers like we've seen before where, he's won 2 MVPs. I think it's going to be really hard to keep him out of the conversation. Number 1, who I think is going to win the MVP this year. We're keeping it out west. All 3 of my candidates here are in the Western Conference. I think it's Shai Gilgeous-Alexander's year. And I'm not just saying that because, as you guys will see as we continue to progress, I'm a pretty big fan of Shai, but I think all the stars are aligning for this. You bring in a guy like Caruso in that backcourt, and I don't think Josh Giddey's as bad as a lot of people will tell you, but Josh Giddey fit nowhere in that Mark Diagonal offensive scheme in Oklahoma City. They needed someone like Caruso, and he's kind of the optimal player to put next to Shai. Now, Shai's defense is really great, but obviously not to the level of like Caruso, and with Alex being able to kind of hang on to that 3-point line, not demand a lot of offensive attention like Giddey would, because Giddey, he's a black hole. He's either standing there, no off-ball movement, or he's kind of holding the ball too long. That didn't work next to Shai, and we still saw how dominant he was with Josh Giddey. Having Caruso is willing to just get out of the way, find his spots is electric, and Shai is going to be a mid-range killer. One thing I really liked from Shai, you see it in the preseason, he talked about it this offseason, he's going to be more willing to shoot threes than ever. And he's one of those guys, kind of a DeMar DeRozan type, where when they come into the league, they have this narrative that they can't shoot threes because they don't often. I don't think that's the case for Shai at all. He shoots super efficient from 3, and, he's stepping into these pull-up threes, he's doing these sidestep sort of things, and it looks a little painful. His shooting motion's not as smooth as you would hope, but, they're cash. They're going in. I think Shai, with this added versatility, if he shoots more threes, and just with an improved roster, I think him, Chet, J-Dub, of course that big 3 is going to be strong, but Hartenstein looking like he's going to miss the first couple weeks, maybe a month of the season. That's going to be a shame, but when he comes back in, we know what Hartenstein does. He's going to be playing bully ball in the post and feeding it right back out to Shai. I think Shai's in for a very high-scoring season. We know he's a plus playmaker. We know, although he's not maybe the best defender in the league, he's tall. He racks up a bunch of steals. The counting stats are going to be there. And I think all of us are under the assumption that Oklahoma City is the first, second, or third best team in the West. I think everything on the resume makes sense for Shai to go out and win that MVP award this year, and I would not be surprised if that's what's going to be the case. Okay, now let's talk Rookie of the Year. I'm the big draft class guy. I'm the big college basketball fan. I'm looking at all this stuff, and I've seen all these guys develop. If you guys have been watching since I was putting up mock drafts this offseason, you guys showed a lot of love to those. It was great. Fuck. Okay, now let's talk Rookie of the Year. The NBA draft, that's kind of my thing. For you guys that have been around for a while, may have seen my mock draft videos, may have seen my big board videos. I love to talk about it. You guys show great engagement on those, and obviously a lot of people willing to argue with me as well. Always warranted, but I'm pretty tapped in with this draft class. And one thing I will say is there's just so much talent down the board that I think there's a guy maybe that gets drafted in that mid-20s range, maybe an early second round sort of pick that comes out and is incredibly impactful. A guy like Cam Christie on the Clippers, who you don't necessarily know if he's going to get a lot of run, but this dude's a good shooter. He's going to a Clippers team with a weak bench. Someone like that could step up and be really impactful. With that being said, you're going to see in my choices, I think the Rookie of the Year, there always is a guy, like I think of Chris Duarte when he was on the Pacers, that he's one of those underrated guys, and he starts out the year really strong, gets a lot of buzz, but those guys never win. You're probably better off in any rookie class, even including this one, which was deep and not very top-heavy, going with some of the first picks. Those are the guys that really step up. So with my third spot in these awards, I'm going to go Alex Sarr. Me with Alex Sarr, I think it's going to be pretty ugly this season, playing on arguably the worst team in the league in Washington, not being a very fine-tuned offensive player. It's not going to be super fun to watch every Alex Sarr game, but he just has such high potential, and honestly, his defensive stats are going to be so good to a level where it's like, I don't think he's going to be Victor, but Victor built up a lot of his status in his rookie season because his defense was so good. I see that with Sarr. Another thing, too, is he's one of the only rookies in this whole class that I can guarantee is starting. So that definitely puts a bit of emphasis on there. Now, starting isn't the end-all, be-all. It's really about the minutes, of course, about how you play in those minutes. But the fact that I know he's the starting four in Washington makes me think that even if Washington's really bad, that he's going to go out there, he's going to get touches. And I talked about a lot in the draft process. If his mid-range develops the same way that we've seen some of these French bigs come into the league and really dominate in that mid-range game, he is a versatile enough offensive player where I know the ball's going to go into the hoop. He's athletic. He plays great defense. He's on a team where he's going to get a really large amount of touches. I think Sarr can be that guy. Moving on to 2 quickly, it's Stephon Castle. I think Stephon Castle, if Chris Paul wasn't in the picture, would kind of be the clear-cut favorite here. He's a great playmaker. He's a great defender. He's tall for a point guard. He is even a bit tall if he runs the 2 this season, which he probably will quite a bit. It's just the Wembanyama factor. You know, this is 2 straight guys where I've talked about Victor somehow, but I think Castle and Vic are going to be a really good duo. I think it makes sense there, and for the Spurs' sake, of course, get Chris Paul. I hope it works out well for them, but I think there's a chance that by midseason we see Chris Paul, the wheels really falling off like we kind of saw in Golden State, and by that time, I have no doubt that Castle will be ready to go in the starting lineup. Again, great playmaker. He finds his way to get buckets. Not the most proficient three-point shooter. He can do that well. And in this offseason, working with Greg Popovich, working with some of the great shooting coaches that San Antonio has, I wouldn't be surprised if he comes out and shoots them at a high clip, even for his rookie season. I don't think he's like a Scoot Henderson level of non-shooter where it's going to take a lot of work to get them to that next level. I think Castle's like right on the border. I could see him having a great year. With that being said, that brings us to number 1, who I think the Rookie of the Year is going to be. And I can't believe this is a hot take, but I do have Zachary Richeche. I know that's like not the betting favorite right now. A lot of people talk about Edey. I think Edey could be in a good spot as well, don't get me wrong. But I think Zach is really that guy. And I know people are worried because he's in that loaded forward room that Atlanta's built. Jalen Johnson is obviously the best of the bunch. DeAndre Hunter can play. They have some other guys like in that room that are going to eat into his minutes, but I think Zach has the potential by the end of this season to be the best of the bunch. He does everything well, and I've heard this argument quite a bit that Trae Young is going to eat into his touches and that Trae Young is this sort of ball hog that's going to make it tough for Zach to develop. Are you kidding me? This guy Trae Young led the league in assists last year. He is a plus playmaker, of course, and he's going to get Zach the touches. I mean, you can't bank on preseason too much, but if any of you watched preseason ball, you understand that Zach was incredible running the break, which is exactly what he was like at JL Borg. He was getting to his spots. He was setting his feet. He was making these difficult jumpers in movement, and also he was putting the ball on the floor. It's not good enough in the modern day to be a 3-and-D guy. You have to have that third thing you do really well, and Zach Zach, he shoots the three, he plays D, and he puts the ball on the floor and in the air. He is really good at finishing through traffic. I think Zachary Ricochet is legit the guy. I think the only thing holding him back could be those minutes, but he was the number one player in this class to me by a wide margin. I know some people didn't believe that. I knew some people really like Klingon. Some people really like Sar as the number one guy. I think Ricochet is the best player in this class, and I think we're overthinking it just a bit. I think he could go out here and win Rookie of the Year. He's going to be my pick for the award. All right, now let's talk DPOY. I'm going to probably breeze through this a little bit quicker because I have 3 centers on here. I think it's just so difficult to win the award as a guard, and even as a Celtics fan myself, when Marcus Smart won it a couple years back, that was just kind of a respect award. He probably wasn't the best individual defender in basketball that year. Even a guy like OG Anunoby, I remember that year, was so incredible. So let's roll with the bigs. Number 3, I have my guy, Nick Claxton. He's just going to load up blocks. He's going to play a ton in Brooklyn. They don't really have anyone else on that front court that's going to contribute. Maybe a guy like Noah Clowney shows out this year. Even then, Claxton, great defensive big man. I think he's going to get his hand on the ball a lot. Probably be pretty high up in deflections and blocks. He's definitely going to be a target up there. I think he is in for a really underrated defensive season. At number 2, I have Bam. I think there's a really good take that Bam is the best defender in basketball right now. I don't think I'm going out on a limb by saying that. Super versatile. Miami, if they continue doing what they've done the last couple years, probably going to be a top 10 defensive team in all of basketball. That's really, I think that's a necessity for someone to win the Defensive Player of the Year, is to be the anchor or at least one of the biggest factors on a defense that is one of the best in the league. I have no doubts that Miami will be one of those teams. Bam, super switchable, super athletic. But at the number 1 spot, I do have Victor Wembanyama. And again, I'm talking about Vic, but that's obviously going to be the big storyline going into the year. How does a guy that is touted to be one of the faces of the league going to show out in his second year after proving all the doubters wrong his rookie season? For Vic, it's just his height. His blocks are going to be insane. His numbers, even last year, he had a case for Defensive Player of the Year. I don't think they were ever going to give it to him because he was a rookie. And, say what you will, Gobert deserved it last year. I think Vic is going to be right up there with the counting stats. I think even with some of the changes they made in the offseason, I think the Spurs defense is going to be top tier again. Just all stars align for Victor being that guy. Don't want to have to overthink it. His stats are going to be there. The talent is obviously there. I think the NBA would love to give Victor a major award again, and I think it would be DPOY. Most improved. This one is kind of fun because you could really make an argument for just about anybody. One thing I'll promise you I won't do is pick a second-year player, and one thing I'll definitely promise you I won't do is pick a guy that's supposed to be a star. I know the NBA's kind of faltered that way recently. The Ja Morant thing definitely stands out as an example as that, but I'm thinking more of these guys that we know have talent, but kind of reach that next echelon of where they're supposed to be. So at number 3, I have Jalen Johnson. Mentioned him a bit earlier when I was talking about Ricochet, but I think in the current moment, Jalen Johnson is obviously the A-dog when it comes to the forward rotation of the Atlanta Hawks, and I think he's going to get more and more touches. He earned a lot of buzz last year because he was being super efficient. He's obviously fun to watch. He's high-flying. He's athletic, but this shooting touch is really what makes me confident that he can be one of those guys going forward. So Jalen Johnson, going to get many opportunities. I think that even if Atlanta kind of falls off a cliff, if Trae Young gets traded at some point, the volume is just going to increase for Jalen Johnson no matter which way you cut it. Super talented player. I think he'll be in that conversation. At number 2, this would only be the second first overall pick to ever win Most Improved, but I do think it's Cade Cunningham. Now, you could argue that what I said about how I'm not going to pick a guy is going to be special or whatever, I think the Cade Cunningham narrative has fallen off a cliff for no good reason. I mean, it was ESPN that put out that top 100 list, and Cade is hanging around guys like Alex Caruso and, oh my goodness, who was even else on there? There's just a bunch of role players and Cade Cunningham, and people have the narrative twisted. Just because the Pistons were horrible last year, lost plus 20 games in a row, does not reflect negatively on Cade to me, because his development, I think he reaches that next level. Cade is in a tough spot. I don't love the team building around him. He doesn't really have any space. Even, of course, Thompson was drafted last year. Then you get Ron Holland this year. Jaden Ivey has his moments, but I don't think he's this incredible three-point shooter. The team is nasty work around him. Don't get me wrong. But I think this is the year where Cade is supposed to take that step. And Cade hasn't been an all-star yet. I think we're seeing it this year. I think this is a Cade all-star run. And by definition, I think that puts him in this most improved player case. But at number 1, I have a guy that nobody's really talking about. I think the big hoops heads have kind of mentioned him a little bit, but I have Denny Avdia. Denny Avdia, most improved player of the year. That's got to be the call for me, and it's simply because I think the opportunity in Portland opens up more things. Now, it's kind of a tough call here because there's no necessary guarantee that he has to start in Portland. Of course, they have guys across the roster. They're going to start Scoot up the 1, Simon's up the 2, then they have Sharp, they have Grant, they have Ayton, they have Klingon. Of course, Denny's more of that traditional small forward. He might come off the bench for a guy like Shaden Sharp, but Denny Avdia, I mean, you've listened to Chauncey Billups talk by now. That is who he sees as the best player on his team. I think Denny Avdia has earned the ability to also put up a lot of shots, too, in Washington. He started out as this guy that wasn't getting a whole lot of touches. He's kind of this off-ball sort of player that really had to prove for himself and had to create for himself in another offense that wasn't super versatile. I think in Portland, it's going to be an interesting team this year, but one thing I can be sure of is I think Scoot's going to be a really dynamic playmaker. I think his assist numbers are going to go up. I think his turnovers are going to go down, and that bodes really well for a guy like Denny Avdia that knows how to create space, that knows how to, he's a good backdoor cutter. He's good at filling positions on the wing. I really just think he's a versatile offensive player, and I think the defense is starting to catch up. I think Denny Avdia is in for a really big year. I think he's the traditional most improved player sort of candidate where it's like you get a new change of scenery. You see a guy come up in a spot where he was kind of getting his talents muddled in a bad situation. And I know Portland's not going to be much better when it comes to how many games they're going to win, but I really think we start to see the flashes of Denny Avdia, maybe not being an all-star, but being one of those fringe-level guys, a guy like Mikal Bridges, a guy like OG Anunoby, maybe a more offensive-oriented version of one of those guys where it's like they're a real needle mover. And I don't think Denny Avdia is going to last in Portland for long because I think he's one of those guys where a contender that has some cap space is going to have to make a deal for him. I think this is a big year for Denny. I think he shows what he's made of. That would be my most improved player choice if, I got to decide right now. Now, Sixth Man of the Year, this one's really kind of cut and dry. There's just only so many guys we know for a fact are going to be coming off the bench right now that we know are super talented. So breeze through it here. Dante DiVincenzo coming into Minnesota. It's going to be a new look for him. Obviously, he was kind of mad with his role in New York. Doesn't like that he started last year and was kind of going to get pushed to the bench. Now they traded him to Minnesota and he's still on the bench, so I feel bad for Dante, but there's no doubt he kind of has that fire lit under him. We saw it in the preseason. He's going to shoot efficiently. He's going to have a lot of touches with the ball. He's playing with Naz Reid off that bench, which may muddle things up a little bit. That's why I don't have him at number 1, but I think that's going to be a pretty popular pick for the award, so I see it there. Number 2, I'm going Bogdan Bogdanovic. Back to the Hawks. This guy is just an elite level shooter. He's kind of one of the ultimate spark plugs, and you expect him to come off the bench this year. He started in the past for Atlanta. In a similar vein to Dante, they play solid defense. They shoot a really high clip from 3. If he catches fire for like 2-3 months in the middle of the year, he's definitely going to have to be in that conversation. And number 1, run it back. I like Malik Monk, obviously in the race for all of last year, seen as one of the best 6 men of the year. They signed him to an extension. I think he really wants to compete on the Sacramento team, who, adding DeMar DeRozan, they should be more competitive out West, even though we'll mention it plenty of times on this podcast, the West is only getting more difficult. I think Malik Monk has the most talent out of anyone we know is going to get looks off the bench. I think Coach Mike Brown and that whole Sacramento Kings team knows that when the bench unit is in, he's the guy that they're looking to put points on the board. So expecting big things from Malik Monk. Kind of an easy call right there. Then lastly, Coach of the Year. This one's tough. I'm basically just predicting which teams I think are going to be good and which coaches that I like. So at 3, I have Mark Diagonal from the Thunder. There's a chance that if this team wins 60 games or more, he's a guy that hasn't won the award before. I think he's going to have to be in that conversation. Similar vein over out east with the Boston Celtics. Now, Mazzulla, of course, was an incredible coach last year, got recognized for that. I think if the Celtics go out and win a exuberant amount of games like they did last season, going to have to be in that conversation, just kind of how like Spo was when the Heat were winning a bunch of games every year. And then my choice, I'm going to pick Jamal Mosley of the Magic. Talk about a team that I have high expectations for. I really expect them as a team to make that next jump. If this was a team out west, this might be a squad we're talking about a 7th or an 8th seed. Out east, I think they're going to have a real conversation to be that 4, maybe even that 3 if all things go right and one of these top contenders Spurs has some problems during the season. I think the Magic are going to be really solid. I think Jamal Mosley has really got that team in tune. I love the way that the roster has been built. I love how the defense has really stepped up in that time. I think Mosley's a really solid coach. If the Magic are one of the best teams in the East, I think he's going to have a really good case for it. And then kind of just to touch on the clutch player of the year, this is kind of like a star player popularity contest to a certain amount. Obviously, you have to show up in the clutch, but it's voter-based. It's not like stats-based. It's not efficiency in the fourth quarter. So guys like, I would really say any guard has a chance on this just because they're going to get the most touches late. Steph, Jalen Brunson, Trae Young, De'Aaron Fox, any of those point guards got it. I think Anthony Edwards wins this. If he's not winning a major award, they're going to give him something. I think Ant's the clutch player of the year. All right, that's all my award talk. Kind of got that out of the way, but, we need a stepping stone. I need you guys to be able to harass me mid-season if one of my takes was horrible, and I need some evidence. I need some proof that once I get these all right, I'm going to showboat it in your face, and we'll probably get 1 million views. It's going to be electric. But on to our next segment. This is what I've been excited for. I'm calling it Spin the Wheel. So very low production value here, but nice little google.com. We have a random NBA team wheel. We're going to land on one of those. Whichever team it lands on, I'm going to go on a little, maybe 5-minute spiel about what my expectations are for them this season, give you some in-depth analysis, and also no notes here. We're just having a casual conversation. So with that being said, let's see who we got. Let's spin that wheel. Who we got? The production value on this is electric. What am I looking at? The Charlotte Hornets. That's definitely a fun team. Some creators that are in the podcasting NBA sphere, personal favorite of mine, Kenny Beecham, KO24Q, he seems to be pretty hot on the Hornets this year, and I can sort of see it. I think LaMelo looking to have this healthy campaign for what feels like the first time in a long time is going to be fun. They have some other contributors. Trey Mann definitely has had a lot of swag this offseason. You've been seeing him with the big shorts and stuff. I think he can go out and be really efficient. And then across the board, Brandon Miller looked really solid his rookie year. If it weren't for a guy like Wemby, I think Brandon Miller is kind of that prototypical rookie of the year candidate. He was really, really solid. And then Mark Williams at center, I think, assuming his health stays there, you get Mark Williams, you get Nick Richards. I have a really versatile sort of front court in Charlotte, but they're in the East. It makes things a little bit easier. My expectations for them is kind of in that 10, 11 seed range, but I think that ceiling, if you're a Hornets fan, what you're looking to expect from your team this year is, why not make a play-in run? I think you have enough talent across the board. They bring in a new head coach, a good head coach, albeit Charles Lee coming from the Celtics. I think he's going to be one of those spark plugs, and we're starting to see the early workings of the Ime Udoka and the Joe Mazzulla tree in Boston. He's kind of one of those guys. I think Charles Lee comes in, has a really big impact on this Hornets team. They're just super young. I don't think you call this season a wash necessarily if you're not super competitive. In the draft this year, you take Tejan Salon. They're clearly going for one of those more experimental project type of talents with a guy like him. So I don't think the expectation needs to be winning, but I think with the Charlotte Hornets, you allow these young guys to develop. You actually make a run at that sort of play-in deal with LaMelo. It's not like years past. It's not like when you first got him where you should be tanking, but you have that duo of Miller and Ball. Just see what they can do. Go out and play a style of game. I think a good goal for them would be either offensively or defensively. Hang out in that top 15. I guess it depends what their vision is. I think it's more realistic for the offense, but if the Hornets can have a top 15 offense in the league, can make a play-in run, I'll consider that a pretty successful season for Charlotte. Spinning again, we are looking at Indiana Pacers. So we're back out east. Another team that there's a big range of projections, you could say. I think that the expectation for Indiana would be to be anywhere between the 4 and the 6 seed. I think when you look out east, there's kind of this 3 or 4-headed monster, depending on who you ask, where I think the expectation is that Boston and New York finish top 2, and then Philly and Milwaukee are kind of in that next echelon after. Philly probably being more talented right now, but with the injury history of Paul George and, of course, Joel Embiid, that makes it tough. And then Milwaukee, you have Giannis, you have one of the best players in the world, kind of seeing if that year 2 connection with Damian Lillard works out. But for Indiana, I think you expect to either be competing with Milwaukee, which of course they did very well last year for that maybe 4 spot, or being 5 or 6. I guess what Indiana wants is to be better than Cleveland and Orlando, which is kind of a tough task. Cleveland, obviously competitive last year. They bring in a new head coach. They have that same roster that seems like they're only getting better and better as they progress on that Donovan Mitchell timeline. That's going to be a tough ask in Orlando. I'm bought in on Paulo. I think Franz Wagner and him make a really good duo. So Indiana, kind of just building on that. Now, Indiana, from a team standpoint, of course, Halliburton with an insane campaign last year, that first half of the season especially, there was like MVP buzz for him. Never really materialized, but you know what you get from Halliburton, best playmaker in basketball right now. Siakam at the trade deadline, a trade where I think a lot of people at the time thought Indiana won, but people were nervous about it, and Siakam kind of showed that he's that fringe all-star sort of guy, and he fit really well. Indiana, a team with some of that fastest pace in the league that moves super quick, and Siakam, a guy that really showed that he's efficient at running in transition. He was finding his spots. He was shooting those corner threes. He kind of did it all. I really liked what I saw from Siakam in Indiana, so those two, your all-star level talents shining, you expect that going forward. You expect that chemistry to get even better. Miles Turner had a tough summer league matchup against Zach Edey, even though that was mostly Isaiah Jackson getting cooked, but media won't tell you that. So you expect Miles Turner, now that we're kind of past the era of every season, we wonder if Miles Turner's getting shipped off at the deadline. I think you're confident that he's that starting center now. Andrew Nembhard locked up on a longer-term deal. He was so good in that playoff run. I mean, Eastern Conference Finals, you take on Boston. Howie's hurt. Siakam's having issues, being efficient. Your best player was arguably, your best starter was Andrew Nembhard. Your best player off the bench was Obi Toppin, who returns. I think he's going to be super important. Indiana, just building a deep team. My only question for them, the expectation is they're competitive out east. They're in that 4 through 6 range. My question is, how does Mathurin mesh? It's always tough when there's a player that misses a season and the team does really well in his absence. I think that's kind of what happened with Julius Randle. Of course, he ends up getting traded to Minnesota because they didn't think in New York that he fit their scheme. But with Mathurin, a guy that was really good at Arizona, was really good his first year with Indiana, how does he mesh into this team now that kind of has built their identity last season, being very impressive, making a kind of unprecedented Eastern Conference Finals run? What does Mathurin do for this team now? I know some people are really high on him. I know some people would include him in that 6 Man of the Year race I talked about earlier. But for me, I worry a little bit of what he's going to do there. You don't want him to be a shot chucker. You don't want him to kind of mess up this bench chemistry with a guy like Ijax, with TJ, with Obi Toppin. So curious to see how he'll fit in there. But Indiana, I think you know what you're going to get. All right, third team on the wheel here. We are looking at the Portland Trail Blazers. That's tough. I touched on them a little bit when we had the Denny conversation, but really for Portland, you don't expect to be competitive, but if I'm them, you really just need to figure out what you're doing in this backcourt. Starting with Scoot Henderson, of course, the number 2 overall pick, and he was just dreadful to start the season. I mean, I'm a personal, pretty big fan of Scoot, and it was really hard to watch. I mean, inefficient, not getting to his spots, had these, he brought the goggles out because he couldn't see. He was just kind of a mess. So with him, that second half of the year campaign isn't going to get talked about. So if I'm a Trailblazers fan, I have that in the back of my mind, that the second half of the season, Scoot Henderson was a really good and a much more efficient ball player. I think next year you expect to see that for a full campaign. Scoot not necessarily having to go out there and be a 25-point per game scorer. Doesn't even necessarily need to average 12, 13 assists, but just being a confident playmaker, a guy that in what is probably Chauncey Billups' last year head coaching this team can go out and run an offense, can be a pest on defense like we saw in the past, and just be that athletic point guard that works well in the modern day NBA. The shot has to come, but he doesn't necessarily need to be this 39, 40% three-point shooter either. Just get up to league average, be at 34, be at 35, and just do what you do well. And then when you talk about figuring out the backcourt, Anthony Simons, I mean, is he the talent that you're willing to extend and, try to make this timeline work where he can be a vet when you guys are hopefully competing for rings at some point? Or is he a trade deadline guy? Do you make up for value that you probably could have got like a year or two ago by trading him at the time? Do you make up for that lost value, or do you just ride the wave and play him out? Curious to see how that goes. Shaden Sharp, another young talent, got to be healthy. I think he goes out there and probably has a pretty good year, but crowded front court, as I mentioned with Denny Avdia, I think he's going to be a six man of the year candidate, trying to get that bench unit going. Or excuse me, I think it's going to be a most improved candidate. So even then, keep that bench going, or start on the spot of a Shaden Sharp where he can move down to a two if Simons is on the way. You have a lot of flexibility, and then in that front court, you have Jeremy Grant there for the time being. Don't think that's a long-term solution, but for now in the center room, you have Ayton, you have Rob Will, and you have Donovan Clingan. One of those guys has to go, and it's not Clingan. I think Ayton sticks around. I think that helps a lot when it comes to Clingan developing his offensive game. Do you get anything for Rob Will when he's good for about 30 games a year? I don't know. So if you're a Trailblazers fan, your expectation is probably you're one of the worst teams in the West, but this is a really fun developmental year. Of course, it was going to be tough last year. Scoot, very exciting, but you're getting a pure point guard, not like one of these combo guards, and you're getting them in his rookie year. It was going to be ugly the whole time. This year, you really see, was that just a tough rookie year? Can he build on that? I think if you get the second half of the season Scoot that we saw, I think you can be optimistic about that. Before we got Detroit. So we went from two pretty competitive teams on both sides to now we got the Trailblazers and the Pistons. For Detroit, you don't really expect much. I think if you still think you need draft capital, being one of the worst teams in the league is probably what's going to be there. But if I'm a Detroit fan, I'm just hoping that Detroit isn't the worst team in the East. I think that's the expectation because you're putting together a somewhat competent basketball team. I think Asor Thompson, assuming he stays healthy, is a really talented player. One of those weird guys where he's never going to be a plus shooter, but he's such a great athlete. He's willing to put the ball on the floor. I think he's going to be dangerous. I think Ron Holland is another guy who I think could have a successful rookie season. You worry about what it's going to look like in the front court with Jalen Duren. Is he that number one guy for you? Obviously never going to be one of the best centers in the league, but great rebounder, great defensive talent. Is he your guy? And then just making things work around Cade Cunningham. You expect him to improve this season. You expect your team as a whole to kind of take that next step. The Monty Williams era didn't work for you, but can you build a competent team in 2024, 2025 after last year was so miserable for you? So for the Pistons, I don't think you have these make or break winning expectations, but kind of similar to Portland. Let your point guard figure it out. Make sure that he really is that face of the franchise guy. I have a lot more faith in Cade being that for Detroit than Scoot being that for Portland. So you have something there. And then I really just think what you want to see this season, especially in that forward range, is who is a guy that can get shipped out and which one of these guys is here to stay. Is Tobias Harris a guy that actually comes back home and is super efficient as your power forward where, you just want to keep him around, kind of how they kept Blake Griffin? If he is, great. If he's making your team more competitive, go for it. If he's a guy that's putting up empty stats and you're still horrible, maybe you can get something out of a trade. So for the Pistons, you don't want to be the worst team in the East, and you want to figure out which of these role players that you're putting next to Cade are here for the long haul. If you can do both of those things this season, I would say you won. Last one. I'll make a wheel graphic for next time we do this segment, but take my word for it, Milwaukee Bucks. So last thing we're going to talk about in that Central Division with Detroit, obviously much different expectations. The word expectations can be lofty depending on who you ask because it always means different things. If we're talking about what I expect from this Milwaukee Bucks team, if I'm a Milwaukee Bucks fan, it's championship or bust. For Milwaukee, you have that run with Frank Vogel as the coach. Giannis playing out of his mind. You knock off a Phoenix team, which on paper was probably built up a little bit better than yours. That's great, but I think we're removed far enough from that where that's not going to cut it. If Giannis walks out of this stint that he has with the Bucks with an MVP, Finals MVP, a ring, that's great and all, but you need to add hardware to the vault. And that Damian Lillard trade is why I put so much pressure on it, because you can't have that duo not work. That says a lot about the team you're building. And if Doc Rivers is the coach that brings you to that depth, great. I don't think he's an incredible coach and a X's and O game plan sort of deal, but apparently the guys like his rotations more in Milwaukee. I'm not a Bucks fan myself, but it seems like the fans are giving him a little bit more slack than they ever gave Bud. So it's going to be tough to say what is meant to be for this team. But With that being said, I think it has to be a ring. Damian Lillard and Giannis, they started the year so bad last season, but we know those are two of the more talented players. I heard Dame talk a lot this offseason about how it's kind of a point guard's nightmare to play with Giannis just because he is such an enforcer. He needs the ball on the offensive end to be involved, but it seems like Dame is figuring that out, being more of a true playmaker, being one of those guys that went from the way he was with the Trailblazers where he'd dribble the ball up to the logo and just shoot it because that's probably their best form of offense, to figuring out how to buy into a team sense, to be a playmaker first, then a spot-up shooter second, and then, hey, maybe he can self-create towards the end of the shot clock if he has to. I think Dame is more than talented enough to be that guy. It's just, is he going to be that guy? Chris Middleton, when he's healthy, he's the ultimate X factor for this team. He's a former All-Star. He's a guy that he can heat up and give you 30 on any given night. That's what Milwaukee needs from him. It's going to be tough. You got to stay healthy. I don't want to say he's injury prone. I know he doesn't think he's injury prone. He's kind of just had an unfortunate series of events, but staying on the court is going to be huge for him. Then Brook Lopez, what is there to say about him? Not a good rebounder, pretty great everything else for his age right now, coming in at 7 foot. Is he going to continue to be a versatile player? I think you expect consistency from him, but he's getting up there in age. If he takes a step back, Milwaukee doesn't have a whole other lot of options when it comes to big men on the roster. So that's going to be really tough. And then some of these rookies, A.J. Johnson, Tyler Smith, I'd like to see those two get involved. But if I'm Milwaukee, I got to keep it simple. I want to win a ring this year. If you go out there and you're maybe the 4th best team in the East, your first or second round exit, I think they're dropping the bomb on your team pretty soon. I don't think you last much longer with this core. You got to get it done this year. All right, that's it for spinning the wheel. Production value will go up on that, I promise. Maybe next time we spin the wheel, I'll make myself a little graphic. But hey, it's episode 1. We need something for when this podcast is incredibly successful and, I can supply myself an editor instead of hopping on Premiere and throwing on some headphones. We'll have something to compare it to. So just keep that in mind. But we're past that segment. Last sort of basketball-related segment I really want to touch on is underrated pickups. And now I won't bore you to death with all the details, but I want to talk about some of the guys in free agency, whether it's through trade or through signing, that maybe aren't being talked about as much as some of the other guys that, we know the big moves. We know Cat. We know pretty much everything the Knicks have done. We know these big signings like DeRozan and PG. Or big trade like DeRozan, big signing like PG. You get the gist. I want to talk about guys that I think are going to be really impactful this season that kind of haven't been touched on as much. And I'll start it out with the Clippers, a team that is probably going to struggle with Kawhi out, not be super competitive in the West. And James Harden might have to play James Harden ISOBALL, and I don't think he is necessarily in a good spot where he should be doing that. With that being said, they made a really good move this offseason. It's Derrick Jones Jr. They're a mess overall, but even if Kawhi plays and he plays the 4, if Kawhi doesn't play and Derrick Jones Jr. has to move around those 3 and those 4 spots, I love it. Look at what Dallas did last season, and that starting 5 was a really incredibly built starting 5. Luka, Kai, Jones, Washington, and then either Gafford or Lively. Jones was the glue on that team. I think on any given night, he was arguably the second or best defensive player. I think Washington in totality might be better. But Derrick Jones Jr. being a really good wing defender, being a really good shooter, being a really good cutter, really smart off the drive, he gives you everything you want from a modern-day forward. And the Clippers paid decent money for him, but they didn't have to blow all of their cap space, which they didn't have much of, but they had a little bit after Paul George leaves them. And I think Derrick Jones Jr. is probably the best thing you're going to get at filling the gap. Now, he's no Paul George. He's not that offensive creator for himself. He can't really be the hub of an offense. But if Harden is going to have the ball in his hands more often, if Kawhi, assuming he's playing, can still get to the mid-range, still run those ISO sort of deals, which sucks a defense in, a guy like Derrick Jones Jr. is going to be wide open. He's going to shoot at a high clip. I think he fits really well on this team. I think there's going to be a chance where if Kawhi doesn't play, he's the second best player on this team, maybe competing for a guy like Zubac for that spot. Really like Derrick Jones Jr. I think the Clippers kind of handled the loss of PG well by bringing in a guy like him. Next up, I want to talk about the Warriors. They kind of do a 2-for-1 here. The Warriors, they lose Clay, but in that sign and trade, they get Buddy Hield, they get Slow-Mo Anderson, and losing Clay is not fun. It's not fun for your team chemistry. Of course, you lose the Splash Brothers. That's not what you want to do, but the Warriors, they weren't competitive last year, even with Clay. Clay, obviously, we can talk about that playing game ad nauseum. He was really bad towards the end of the season. He wasn't shooting well, and Clay, with his injury history, with him getting up there in age, if he's not shooting like prime Klay Thompson, he doesn't need to be on your roster. The Mavericks get him at a low price point. That's good for them. They're competing anyways. The Warriors, I think it was time to let him go. So losing Clay, you allow a guy like AirPods to step into that shooting guard spot. I think it's going to be really good there. Kuminga is going to get more and more touches, assuming he can start. You don't really know because they kind of have a flood at forward position. I feel like I've said that about maybe 10 NBA teams. A lot of teams have too many good forwards, which it's not a bad problem to have, but when it comes to the sign and trade that the Warriors got back, they get Buddy Hield, they get Kyle Anderson. Now, Buddy Hield, I won't fall into the propaganda of saying he's going to be a really impactful six man or anything, but we know he can shoot. We know he can play in a Steve Kerr offense. That's about as much as you can ask for. And even if he's not this electric 15-point per game scorer, if he's putting up 9 or 10 and shooting a super high clip off the bench for you, that's about all you can ask for. And then with Kyle Anderson, I don't want to get tied up in this preseason stuff too much, but do you guys see the way he's shooting? He's completely changed his jumper. Steve Kerr must have liked something if he was willing to bring in this non-shooter on the Golden State Warriors that is going to be playing and is going to be required to put up shots. Steve Kerr and that coaching staff must have said, hey, we can fix something there. And if that's the case, Kyle Anderson automatically becomes one of the most impactful bench players in the whole league. So with that being said, I think you get two really high ceiling, although low floor, two high ceiling sort of bench players when you lose Clay, when I think the majority of people thought they were going to lose Clay for nothing. I think the Warriors had a really underrated offseason with that move, or, those two players coming in. Another one, Tyus Jones to the Suns. Simple. He's going to be the starting point guard this year. Got guaranteed starting point guard minutes and a role in that spot. Coach Bud's going to be there. He loves having a point guard that can set up the offense. So you assume that Beal, Booker, KD, and Nurkic are starting around him. You expect Tyus to just have a really good playmaking season. You don't need this guy to even put up double-digit points. Just need him to swing the rock, and I'll throw Monte Morris in here as well. I think he's going to be a really solid backup point guard for the Suns. If Tyus happens to go down, Monte Morris fits that bill just the same. So Suns go from having no point guards to two that I think you can start on a competitive NBA team. Great offseason from them. And lastly, we'll talk about Gary Trent to the Bucks. I kind of fell into my own trap here. I didn't even mention Gary Trent when I was breaking down my expectations for the Bucks, but at that shooting guard position, I don't think Milwaukee is looking for too much. They definitely don't want a guy that requires the ball in his hand. So a guy like Gary Trent Jr. that spaces the floor and is a quick shooter. I think there's a difference between a willing shooter and a quick and efficient shooter. Gary Trent, he doesn't need to put the ball on the floor. He doesn't like to hold the ball, survey things out, and then pull it. He gets the ball in the wing. No one's going to have to tell him twice to shoot. I think Gary Trent Jr., assuming he keeps things at a high clip, which you can only assume for now, plays good enough defense to, even if he doesn't play at an elite level on the perimeter, a guy like Chris Middleton, a guy down low like Giannis and Brook, make it super easy for him. I think Gary Trent Jr. slides right in, and he's not making that much money. Of course, the Bucks can afford him, which is shocking with all of the contracts they pay. I think it was really good value, and even if he's not doing a whole lot, he's kind of that fifth starter that you're happy to have on a championship team. And, even if he is terrible, you're not paying him enough where you're looking back on this saying, wow, we really washed away an offseason. Honestly, just because it's the first episode, I'm going to do this a little bit. I really hate doing it. I mentioned it at the start. I don't want to be looking at, let's guess how many games the Pacers are going to win or the Magic are going to win. That's a waste of an episode. I'm not going to go down every contender and say how many games they're going to win, or say, get into a fight with someone in the comments because I think the Hawks are a 9th seed and they think they're an 8th seed or 10th seed, right? That's not worth it. But just because the season is starting today or tomorrow, whenever you end up watching this, whenever this video comes out, I will talk about just briefly teams I think are competitive on both sides. I think obviously Celtics, Knicks, 76ers, if they're healthy in the East. And then I do think a team like the Bucks is that 4th team in the East that I think can go out and win it. Talked about the Bucks a decent bit. I think the Pacers, Magic, Cavs are kind of in that tier after, where I think they're playoff locks, but, if something goes wrong, if one of their stars gets hurt, that's not the case. And even if all goes right, I don't think they're fighting for an NBA Finals. Out west, OKC, Dallas, Minnesota, I think is right up there. Phoenix, if the Tyus Jones thing works out really well, I think Phoenix is right up there. Those are kind of the 4 teams I think could do it. I think most likely would be Oklahoma City, and then I think Phoenix is right there. I think this is kind of this last year where this KD Beal Booker thing could work. I think they know that as well, and they're going to try to capitalize. Then there's some other teams in the West that are playing it out. Do the Lakers have a run? Do the Warriors have a run? Do the Rockets make the playoffs? Does year 2 Wemby catapult this Spurs team, which probably isn't good enough to make the playoffs, to it? And then maybe the Kings. I think the Kings are right up in that conversation as well. Obviously, the West looking a little bit more competitive than the East. They're not as top-heavy either. I think any team I mentioned could be a Western Conference Finals sort of squad, but I would put the Thunder in that top tier, and then I would probably slide Phoenix in not too far after. So that's all I got for standings and that sort of talk. I want this podcast to be casual, but I don't want you guys to just hear me blabbering off ESPN predictions and stuff like that. Who cares? As the weeks go by, I'll give you some updates, talk about contenders and pretenders and all that. But for now, that's what I think of the teams that are contending on each side of the conference. And then lastly, I want to introduce this new segment where we just talk about whatever. I don't really, no script written on this one, no script written all episode necessarily. But yeah, just on basketball related, what's going on in my life, man. I was just home. Came back to school, had a nice little drive today, and now we're here. And another thing that we'll probably end up talking about on this podcast quite a bit, assuming you guys are interested, is music. Big music guy. I like talking about that a lot. So, a couple new drops on the way back to school. I heard the new Ian album. I heard the new Yeet album. And if you guys are fans of the channel, you probably saw Banning react to both of those on stream. He's catching a lot of flack from some of you guys because he loved maybe didn't love it, but he liked the Ian record. He didn't like the Yeet record, and everybody was giving him some hell for it. I didn't like either. I thought they were both pretty bad. Ian, I kind of had less expectations going into it because, he already dropped maybe this year or super late last year, and, he's good for a couple bangers, like a year. Maybe it sounds like, we're in year 1 of that right now. So we'll see if that develops into anything serious. But he's not an album artist. Didn't expect the album to be very good. It wasn't. Song with Chief Keef was fun. But, dude, why is Ian doing the speaker knockers thing? It's funny to me if you want to hear music like that that's actually, guaranteed to slap. Listen to speaker knockers. Rest in peace. But I have no hate for Ian. Do I look like I would hate Ian? I kind of fit the bill of a lot of his fans, so it's fine. And then Yeet, I think Yeet's a better artist. I'm not this crazy super fan of him either, though. Didn't think the Yeet record was really that good at all. But, that's one of those where maybe could grow on me. The album he dropped earlier this year, 2093, I didn't like it all when it released. Then, songs like Bought the Earth grew on me. So, there's some potential there. Big X dropped. I actually really liked his album a lot. Big X the Plug. He reminds me a ton of that album in particular. Reminded me of Kirk by DaBaby. Kind of one of their first commercial releases after they blow up. They had for DaBaby, he had a Baby on Baby before that, whatever the album was called. With the classic album cover. That was one that hit commercial streaming. Everybody really liked it. And then he drops Kirk, which is a follow-up and doesn't necessarily sell the same, but it showcases that talent he has. Now, DaBaby kind of fell off a cliff, so hoping that doesn't happen to Big X. But for Big X the Plug, he had a Mar and then the Deluxe, which really showcased what he could do. He had a couple songs get big off that. And then this new album from Big X the Plug, I think, is his version of Kirk. I think some of the songs are more sentimental. Of course, a lot of them are going to sound the same. He's pulling out that Texas style. He's not singing on a track, but, just showcasing consistency, showcasing talent. I like that Big X drop. Out of the 3 I've talked about so far, it's my favorite. Another underrated album, Jordan Ward, Junie, dropped a collab little EP sort of deal. I think it was 6 songs. That was fire. Not super. I'm not a mega fan of either of them, but listen to all Jordan Ward stuff. I like it quite a bit. Junie, listen to a lot of his collabs with Brent Faiyaz and such. That was fire. I actually really like that album. So I'll tell you how to peep that if you wanted to. And then by the next time we sit down here, Chromacopia is going to be dropping, the Tyler the Creator album, just a few days after. So you're unfortunately going to get my late reactions to this. I thought we were going to get to talk about it, but man's is dropping on a Monday. These come out on Mondays or Tuesdays from now on. So you're going to get my week late reaction, but just talking about the previews here, the song Saint Chroma with Daniel Caesar, that sounded amazing. By the time this video comes out, hey, maybe you guys and I got a single by then, officially, if it's Chroma or it's something else. But I mean, that album is just gonna be crazy. I'm hype. I'm hype. Big Igor guy, probably one of my favorite albums ever. Don't want to get too ahead of myself, I'm over a week out of it, so I'll keep the expectations low for now. Let us to maybe hear some of the music first before I start jumping to conclusions. But yeah, in the what's going on section of this podcast, we only talked about music, but we'll have some more stuff going on. And there's just one more thing. So I want to introduce this segment. It's Ask Colin. Shout out to Kenny Beecham once again. He had Ask KB. You're asking CJ. I'm going to put a Google poll in the description, and then I'm going to be checking the comments as well, so you can just leave a thought down there. But ask me something. It can be basketball related. I'll go in depth about it. It can be personal. We can talk music if y'all are feeling it. But yeah, I'll have the form in the description. Ask me anything you want. Leave your name in there. And then at the end of these episodes, I will be answering your questions. So leave me something good. Don't get too crazy, but you can ask me whatever. And yeah, just kind of get the feedback there and, work with you guys as well. And then it gives me a sense of what you guys want me to talk about too. So this first episode might be a little awkward this time, but I promise you, as things get smoother, as we keep doing this, I'm going to be responding to your questions. It's going to be fun. All right, guys, that is going to do it for episode 1 of ISOBALL. Appreciate you guys for watching and listening. If this one's not on streaming as an audio podcast, the next couple ones will. So for the visual watchers, appreciate you guys on the channel. And for the audio listeners, appreciate you guys as well. But yeah, that's going to do it for episode 1. Appreciate you guys tuning in. And hey, we're only getting bigger and better from here. And once this is officially one of the top 5 most streamed, one of the top 5 most watched basketball podcasts on all platforms, you can go home and tell everybody that you saw the first episode. So I've been Colin Martin. This is ISOBALL. Make sure to check out all the other videos we have coming up on the channel soon. Banding is streaming. Make sure to check them out tonight or tomorrow, depending on when you watch this. Appreciate you guys so much. We'll see you in the next one. Peace out.